I think that you're right on in terms of collecting the data, and it's extremely important to collect data so that you have a solid way to measure, where you're going. It also helps clarify your thinking and how you do what you do. The question, I guess, and we have done some of that. I don't know, you haven't seen some of our surveys that we've done, I take it.
We spoke about it, but yeah.
We can get those to you as well. But establishing a baseline survey and do a more longitudinal study would be fabulous, addressing different measure points that you mentioned. The risky behaviors, the self-determination of the individual, self-efficacy that you got into, the trauma, risky behaviors. Trauma is something that comes, the individual brings the trauma to the situation, right? And then is what we'd be trying to do is have an environment that helps mitigate the effects that the individual experiences. The environment can either accentuate the experience of trauma or can diminish the effect of the trauma. But I guess the bigger question is that in collecting data, it is challenging, because anytime that we're launching on establishing a baseline, collecting data, is what we've done in the past is basically let the staff members know that, okay, you have two jobs now. Now I want your data you have to think like a researcher. You're collecting data, this is how you're going to collect the data, which is separate from the services that they're providing. And if you get those confused, how you collect your data and the methods around it is hugely important. Because if you do that, that your methods are not good, then basically your data is not going to be good. Your data collection methods, and so that's always been a challenge.
We spoke about that yesterday when I spoke to them on the phone, because I was explaining just that it's like you could be a great outreach worker, but you could be really terrible at asking questions, and then it skews all the data because you're just not asking in a way to really pull it.
They're really different skill sets.
Exactly.
A good analogy would be you watch any sport, like basketball, for instance. You always have the coaches on the sideline collecting data, really, information about how the game is being played. The players themselves cannot collect that data, meaning the outreach worker themselves cannot be collecting that data. Someone else needs to be doing that, overseeing it, and organizing the data. Data is useless unless it's organized, and that you can make sense out of it. That's another position, really.
That's absolutely true. And then the other piece is the cost. In terms of allocation of resources. If you can set and have, and some agencies do this, where they set up and the staff is putting everything into a database, and they really become data collectors and not providing the quality of service that they need to provide. So anytime that we've launched a survey of any type, we've always taken into account how is this going to affect services, how we do what we do. And the only time that and then also how does it affect the participant? Do we need, and that's another question you always have to ask, because it's always interesting when individuals get into the research mode. Well, I'd like the answer to this question or that question. But what you have to ask yourself ultimately is, do I really need that information, or is it you have to prioritize basically? the information that you collect, because all of that takes time
Right.
to collect.
Right.
And so identifying those key factors that you want to measure, like ER visits, inpatient hospitalization, possibly the interfacing with the primary care provider, with some instrument that they use
Right.
that looks at the
Right.
medical evaluation, and you can establish a baseline when they were on the streets and all. Then you can also use attitudinal survey
Right.
to get at how they experience, because someone could tell me, oh, you're doing a lot better, John, you're healthier. But, well, I don't feel healthier.
That's why the instruments you mentioned,
Yeah.
we don't expect the existing staff to put together those instruments. That's why I suggested, Andy, putting you on the spot. I'm suggesting that the university could come up with those instruments by having some students maybe work on a project whereby they do that. That's what they do.
Yeah.
I think it's Joel. Joel's-
Yeah, that's where kind of I was going.
So that's the additional staffing
Yeah.
needed. I know funding is a big concern here, and that's why you could initiate that by working something out with the university here.
Yeah, and it can be made fairly lean, if we spend the time identifying the very specific areas that we want to measure, and narrow that down, then it's not so
Right.
bad. It's when you come in going like, well, I want to measure everything, that's when it turns into a total quagmire.
Right.
How many of you are familiar with the HMIS system? Yeah, so it's a really interesting, centralized data management system that's used
Right,
by the LA
yeah.
Homeless Services
Sorry.
Authority, that most agencies who get the funding
Right.
from that
Mhm.
source have to use.
Yeah.
One of the things that Robert and I recently had a conversation about was this is, you know, if you're getting funding from LASA, you have to enter like all this data
Mhm.
into
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
HMIS system.
Once a year?
Yeah, and no,
Continuously.
continuously throughout the year, right? So we recently got back our points to renew the contract, and we had lost a significant number of points because they only went as far, it had to do with the folks that had fallen out of housing. But when we really paid attention to it, it's like, well, all those people, more than half of them are all rehoused now. And that's because of our efforts, but you're not taking that into consideration, LASA. And so you docked us some points here, but you don't know the rest of the story.
Right.
So how is this real, you know, so I just want you to think about that as you think about this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, because it's so important.
Yeah.
I think we're probably one of the few agencies who really knows what happened after the person fell out of housing, because we keep working with them.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's
It's not reflected.
Yeah, it's not reflected, well, in the way that they're collecting data, so now that's all measurable. It's just that they're not measuring it. And from my experience in the field, for many individuals, that's part of the process of finding a home. Because that's really what's happening, is an individual goes in, moves into some place because maybe it's a project based voucher. And that voucher is just attached to that specific unit, and that specific building, in that specific neighborhood. And it's not a good fit. And so that individual is not going to see that housing where he is as their home. And if they do not see that as their home, they will not say, they'll see it as transitional, they will even self-sabotage to get out. And in all of the attitudinal surveys that we do, I always have a question about how do they perceive their home, where they live. And it's basically home, transitional housing, or other. And I always say, that's the most important question on the survey. Because how they perceive it, I could tell you, if I just had one question to look at, and if you have a high number, a good percentage that are perceiving their housing as transitional, you have challenge. I can tell you right now that staff and everybody's gonna be challenged. But if there's a high percentage that are conceptualizing where they live as their home, much less. Because there's ownership, they're invested. They are going to be willing to do more to keep that housing than they would if they didn't care about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is key. But yeah, no, but research, and we don't do enough of it. Yeah, we haven't really valued it as well as we should have, or should. And I've always been a proponent for that, for using it more. But we need to. Yeah. And linking with you guys, if that's possible, would be helpful.
We're here. I told Rudy the other night, I said, he said, well, I certainly hope we can keep this relationship, going. And I said, we're in this together. So,
Thank you.
I can't make concrete promises, but I certainly can suggest that there are any number of people in the room who probably are willing to lend their energies to the cause. So,
yeah, and we can do it efficiently, so it's not.
yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, I think the idea of, prioritizing what you need to know, you can't go into this with a kind of a wide-eyed curiosity so much like, oh, I'm sure there's all kinds of fun things we can find out, or not so fun. I think targeted to what's best going to serve the organization, what's best going to serve the tenant, the person, and I think that's, number one, but also how can you critique the way in which data is received by the agencies that you have to report to. So having somebody give that level of analysis and write a critique like that, who knows, maybe that gets corrected over time.
Well, it's interesting, my approach has been, because I've developed all the surveys. And I don't, I only ask things that I feel are gonna help us improve our understanding.
Right.
Period. And is what I found is that what we do is much more, we ask much more of ourselves than our funders do. They ask stuff because they feel obligated to have to kind of ask questions because we need this money. And they don't really look at it or using it in any meaningful way. And we should never ask any questions or do any research that is not going, that we do not know exactly how this is going to help inform what we do and how we do it.
Where's this video going?
To you.
I'm just kidding. To our funders.
To you. To you. And then
Only to you.
Whatever you want. So we probably need to move on to the next
I'm not
group.
afraid to say that.
No, I know. I mean,
Who is the next group?
Good job,
The next
Gail.
Team who?
The proposition